Most people believe strength comes from knowing what to do next, from advice, reassurance, or someone else saying, "Yes, that's the right choice." But there's a quiet truth many people miss. The more we search outside for certainty, the more uncertain we often feel inside. And that strange tension leaves many people quietly exhausted. Perhaps you've felt it too. A moment when someone criticizes you and the words linger longer than they should. Or when a decision appears and suddenly you wonder, "Am I doing this right?" So you ask a friend, then another, hoping someone will steady the ground beneath your feet. Yet somehow, even after the answers come, the doubt still whispers. It's not that you're weak. In fact, people who care deeply about doing the right thing often struggle with this the most. They listen carefully, adjust themselves, try to stay aligned with the world around them. But slowly, without noticing, they begin to trust every voice, except their own. And that's where the real exhaustion begins. Here's the surprising part, though. The strength you've been searching for might not be something you need to build. It might already exist, quietly waiting beneath all the noise, like a compass hidden in your pocket, gently pointing in the right direction. Not loudly, not forcefully, just patiently. In this story, you'll meet someone who spent years searching for direction in other people's opinions, until one small moment and one unusual lesson showed him something unexpected. That sometimes the most powerful guidance doesn't come from outside at all. It appears the moment we grow still enough to hear ourselves again. And once you experience that kind of quiet strength, life begins to feel very different. There once was a man named Elias who had a quiet habit he barely noticed. Whenever life grew uncertain, he'd look around for someone to tell him what to do. A friend's opinion, a stranger's praise, even a small nod of approval. Those things steadied him, at least for a moment, and when they came, he'd breathe easier, as if the ground beneath him had finally stopped shifting. But when no voice appeared to guide him, a small unease crept into his chest. Elias didn't think of himself as weak, far from it. He worked hard, spoke kindly, and did his best to keep life moving forward. Still, decisions felt strangely heavy when he had to make them alone. So he'd ask another person, then another, like someone knocking on doors in the dark. Some nights he wondered why confidence seemed to live everywhere except inside him. On difficult days, he'd replay conversations in his mind. A careless remark from a coworker, a lukewarm response from a friend. Those little moments would cling to him like burrs on a jacket, and somehow, they'd whisper that maybe he wasn't doing life quite right. He tried to fix that feeling the only way he knew, by searching harder for reassurance, by asking, "What do you think?" before asking himself anything at all. It became a quiet reflex, like reaching for a light switch in a dark room, though lately he noticed the light never stayed on for long. Some evenings he'd sit by the window after everyone else had gone home. The world outside looked calm, almost certain of itself. Cars moved with purpose, lights glowed steadily in distant apartments. Meanwhile, Elias felt like someone holding a compass that refused to settle. The needle spun gently, as if unsure where north really was. He often wondered when that spinning had started. Maybe after criticism that stung a little deeper than expected, or after moments when people he trusted disagreed with him. Each time it happened, he adjusted himself slightly, hoping to stay aligned with everyone else. Over time, though, the adjustments began to blur his own direction. Funny thing was, Elias didn't notice how tired that made him, constantly checking the emotional weather around him, reading faces, tones, pauses in conversation, like a sailor watching every cloud instead of the sea itself. And, well, even sailors need somewhere steady to steer from. One quiet night, with the room dim and the spinning compass resting on the table beside him, a small question drifted through his mind. It arrived softly, almost shy. What if the direction he kept searching for wasn't outside at all? What if the compass had never been broken, only ignored? And that thought, gentle as it was, stirred something that hadn't moved in a long time. The next morning, Elias carried the little compass in his pocket. He hadn't planned to bring it, yet somehow his hand reached for it before leaving home. The needle still drifted restlessly beneath the glass. Left, right, then somewhere in between, like a thought that couldn't quite settle. And Elias couldn't help wondering if it behaved that way for a reason. For years, he had believed strength was something people gathered from the outside, from praise, agreement, encouragement, like warmth borrowed from someone else's fire. And when those flames faded, so did his sense of direction. It seemed natural at the time, though lately it felt strangely exhausting. That morning he paused at a crosswalk longer than necessary. Cars rolled past, people hurried by, voices floated through the air. Everyone seemed to know where they were going. Meanwhile, Elias felt the compass shift again in his pocket. Not wildly, just enough to remind him something inside was unsettled. He realized something quietly uncomfortable. He had spent years trying to arrange the world around him so he could feel steady within it. A careful dance of pleasing, adjusting, asking. But perhaps steadiness wasn't built that way at all. Perhaps it began somewhere much closer to home. The thought lingered like the first warmth of sunlight through a window. Maybe true strength didn't grow through noise and motion. Maybe it formed in quieter places, moments when no one else was speaking, and a person had no choice but to listen inward, moments most people tried to avoid. Elias noticed how rarely he allowed that kind of silence. There was always a message to check, a conversation to replay, another opinion waiting somewhere if he searched long enough. The world was wonderfully loud when you were afraid of your own stillness. But now and then, usually late at night, something different happened. The noise would fade just enough for him to hear a quieter voice beneath it all. Not dramatic, not commanding, just a gentle sense of knowing that appeared when everything else stopped talking. A feeling he often dismissed too quickly. Standing there at the corner, hand resting lightly over the compass in his pocket, Elias wondered if he'd misunderstood strength entirely. What if it didn't come from gathering more voices around him? What if it appeared the moment he stopped chasing them? The compass needle trembled softly beneath his fingers, and somewhere ahead, though he didn't yet know how, that question was about to lead him to someone who lived in that quiet certainty every day. Later that week, Elias found himself sitting alone on a wooden bench near a quiet park path. The afternoon was calm, yet his mind moved like restless wind. In his palm, the small compass turned again, its needle drifting without conviction. He tapped the glass lightly, as if a small nudge might persuade it to behave, but it only spun a little slower, then wandered once more. It wasn't just the compass that felt uncertain. That morning he had received a simple comment at work. Nothing harsh, just a brief criticism. Still, it echoed in his mind like a stone dropped into a still pond. He replayed it again and again, wondering if he'd done something wrong. And as usual, he had asked 3 different people what they thought. Their answers were kind, yet strangely unsatisfying. One said he was overthinking. Another offered advice he didn't fully agree with. A third simply shrugged and said, "It's nothing." But none of those voices quieted the uneasy feeling inside him. Elias sighed and leaned back on the bench. "Why is this so hard?" he murmured to himself. Trusting others came easily. Trusting his own judgment, though, that felt like walking on thin ice. Every step carried the faint fear that something might crack beneath him. He glanced down again at the compass. It occurred to him that he treated himself much like that little instrument. Whenever its needle drifted, he assumed it needed fixing. Whenever his feelings wavered, he assumed someone else must know better. Somehow, his own sense of direction always seemed suspect. A small breeze rustled the leaves overhead. It carried the quiet sounds of the park, distant footsteps, birds shifting between branches. The world felt peaceful enough, yet Elias struggled to sit comfortably in that peace. Silence had a way of making his thoughts louder, and he wasn't always sure he liked what he heard. Sometimes he wondered what would happen if he stopped asking everyone else, if he simply listened to himself for once. The idea felt both freeing and unsettling, like standing at the edge of unfamiliar water. What if his inner voice led him the wrong way? What if it had been wrong all along? The compass shifted again in his hand, its needle trembling as if caught between directions. Elias watched it carefully, almost hoping it might finally settle. Instead, it hesitated, then turned again. He frowned slightly, unaware that before the afternoon ended, someone nearby would notice that restless compass and ask him a question that would change the way he understood it entirely. Not long after that thought crossed his mind, Elias noticed someone standing a few steps away. An older man had paused along the park path, watching the compass in Elias's hand with quiet curiosity. He didn't stare in an intrusive way, just a soft, observant glance, like someone noticing the weather. Then he smiled slightly and gestured toward the little instrument. "That one seems to be having a busy day," he said. Elias let out a small, embarrassed laugh. "Yeah, it does that a lot," he admitted. He turned the compass in his palm, watching the needle wander again. "I think it's broken," he added, tapping the glass gently. though somehow saying it aloud made him feel as if he were describing more than the object itself. The older man sat beside him without hurry. For a moment, he simply watched the trees sway in the light breeze. Then he nodded toward the compass again. Sometimes a compass spins when it's surrounded by too many magnetic forces, he said calmly. Too many influences pulling it in different directions. Elias blinked at that. He hadn't thought of it that way before. The needle didn't look damaged, just unsettled, almost as if it were trying to listen to several directions at once. A bit like his own mind after a long day of advice and opinions. He tilted the compass slightly, curious now. The needle flickered, then turned again, unable to commit to a single point. Maybe it's confused, Elias joked softly. The man chuckled under his breath. Well, he said, compasses rarely get confused on their own. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt strangely comfortable. Elias noticed how still the man seemed. No restless movement, no hurried thoughts in his expression. Just a calm presence, as steady as the trees rooted around them. And somehow, sitting near that stillness made Elias feel slightly less tangled inside. The man finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You know, he said gently, if you place a compass in a quiet place, away from interference, it almost always finds north. His voice carried no lecture, only simple observation. But if you surround it with noise, it keeps searching everywhere except the right direction. Elias looked again at the spinning needle in his hand. The comparison settled over him slowly, like a realization arriving on soft footsteps. Maybe the compass wasn't broken after all. Maybe it had simply been surrounded by too many forces pulling at once. And something about that thought made him wonder what might happen if, just for a moment, everything became quiet. The older man rested his hands loosely on his knees, as if he had all the time in the world. Elias noticed something curious about him. Nothing flashy, nothing demanding attention. Yet the calm around him felt solid, almost like standing near a quiet lake at dawn. People passed by on the path, but the man didn't seem pulled by any of it. He simply watched the day unfold, steady as a stone warmed by sunlight. You carry that compass often? The man asked after a moment. Elias shrugged lightly. Not really. I found it in an old drawer this morning. He turned it slowly in his fingers again. For some reason, it seemed important today. The man nodded as if that made perfect sense. Objects have a funny way of appearing when we need a mirror, he said. Elias raised an eyebrow, half amused, half curious. A mirror? Yes, the man replied softly. Something that shows us what we haven't noticed yet. Elias studied the compass again, watching the needle drift like a restless thought. Well, if it's a mirror, he said with a faint grin, it's not giving me very good news. The man chuckled gently. Oh, I wouldn't say that. Sometimes the most helpful mirrors show us movement, not perfection. They sat quietly for a while, the leaves overhead whispering in the breeze. The man didn't rush to fill the silence with explanations. He seemed comfortable letting the moment breathe. Eventually, Elias realized something unusual. He wasn't feeling the usual urge to ask for advice. Instead, the man spoke again, softly. Tell me, he said, when that needle spins like that, what do you usually do? Elias shrugged. Tap it, shake it a little, try to make it settle. The man nodded slowly, as if hearing something deeper in that answer. And does it help? He asked. Elias looked down at the wandering needle and laughed under his breath. Not really. The man's eyes sparkled with quiet understanding. Sometimes the best way to help a compass, he said, is simply to stop interfering with it. Elias felt something in that sentence land gently in his chest. The man wasn't telling him to fix anything. He wasn't offering strategies or instructions. Just a simple invitation to pause. And somehow, that small idea opened the door to a lesson Elias hadn't expected. The man picked up a small pebble from the ground and rolled it slowly between his fingers. Most people think clarity comes from doing more, he said gently. More asking, more searching, more adjusting. He glanced at the compass in Elias's palm. But sometimes clarity arrives the moment we stop stirring the water. Elias watched the spinning needle, feeling oddly seen. That sounds nice, he admitted, but my mind doesn't exactly enjoy being still. The man smiled as if he'd heard that sentence many times before. Minds rarely do, he said warmly. That's why stillness is a practice, not a talent. He gestured softly toward Elias's chest. Try something simple, he suggested. Close your hand around the compass for a moment. Elias hesitated, then did as asked. The metal felt cool against his palm. Now breathe once, the man continued. Slowly in, slowly out. Elias followed the rhythm without thinking too much about it. The world seemed to quiet just a fraction. Even the leaves above rustled more softly. "What do you notice?" the man asked. Elias opened his hand again and looked down. The needle still moved, though more gently now. "I guess it's calmer," he said, a little surprised. "Funny what happens when we stop shaking the compass." The man nodded approvingly. "Your inner world works much the same way," he said. "When thoughts, opinions, and worries keep tugging at you, direction becomes hard to see." He tapped the bench lightly with one finger. "But the moment you give your attention inward, things begin to settle." Elias considered that quietly. "So you're saying the answers are inside?" he asked. The man chuckled softly. "Not hidden like a treasure chest," he replied. "More like a quiet voice that only speaks when the room grows calm." They sat there for another minute, saying nothing. Elias watched the compass again, curious now, rather than frustrated. The needle wavered, but its movement no longer felt chaotic. And somewhere in that small shift of perspective, he began to wonder what might happen if he practiced this kind of quiet more often. Over the next few days, Elias found himself returning to that quiet bench more often. Not because someone told him to, but because something inside him felt curious. Each time he arrived, the park greeted him with the same gentle rhythm, leaves shifting, distant footsteps, the quiet hum of ordinary life. And in his hand, the little compass waited patiently. At first, sitting there without distraction felt strangely uncomfortable. His mind tried to wander everywhere at once. A conversation from yesterday, a worry about tomorrow, even a random memory of something mildly embarrassing from years ago. Instinctively, he reached for the compass and gave it a small shake. The needle spun wildly again. Elias couldn't help but laugh at himself. "Well, that looks familiar," he murmured softly. The compass, it seemed, was an honest teacher, so he tried something different. Instead of shaking it, he placed it gently on his palm. Then he took one slow breath in and one slow breath out, just as the old man had suggested. Nothing dramatic, nothing mystical, just a quiet pause. To his surprise, the restless storm in his mind softened a little. Not gone, of course, but less noisy, like a room where people had stopped arguing. The compass needle still moved, though now it wandered with less urgency, as if it too appreciated the calmer atmosphere. Days passed like that, small moments of stillness tucked into ordinary afternoons. Sometimes Elias simply watched his breath for 30 seconds. Other times he placed the compass on the bench and wrote a single sentence in a small notebook. What do I actually feel right now? Little by little, something began to change. When criticism appeared, it didn't shake him as deeply. When uncertainty arrived, he paused before rushing to ask someone else. And the compass, well, more often now, its needle found a direction and stayed there. Not perfectly, but long enough for Elias to notice. One evening, as golden light stretched across the park path, he held the compass again. This time the needle settled with quiet confidence. Elias smiled faintly, feeling something similar settle inside his chest. And though the world around him hadn't changed much, he had the strange sense that the next real test of this new steadiness wasn't far away. A few mornings later, Elias stepped into the office with the same quiet routine as always. Coffee in one hand, compass resting lightly in his pocket. The room buzzed with the usual energy, phones ringing, chairs sliding, conversations crossing the air, ordinary sounds of a normal day. Yet something about the morning carried a faint sense of anticipation. It didn't take long for the moment to arrive. During a meeting, a colleague questioned one of Elias's ideas rather bluntly. The words weren't cruel, but they landed with that familiar sharpness. For years, this would have sent Elias searching for reassurance. A quick glance around the room, a silent question in his mind. What does everyone else think? He felt the old reflex stir again, that urge to explain himself quickly, to adjust his words so everyone would agree, to leave the room feeling approved. But halfway through that impulse, something else quietly interrupted. Elias slipped his hand into his pocket and touched the compass. He didn't even pull it out. He simply rested his fingers against the smooth metal surface. Then he took one slow breath in and one slow breath out. Just a pause, barely noticeable to anyone else. In that tiny moment of stillness, the noise in his mind softened. The room felt clearer, as if someone had opened a window. Instead of scanning faces for approval, Elias listened inward for a second. And there it was, that quiet sense he had been learning to recognize. Simple, calm, steady. So when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, not defensive, not eager to please, just honest and grounded. "This is the direction I believe makes the most sense," he said gently. Something interesting happened next. The room grew a little quieter. People nodded, not dramatically, but with subtle respect. It wasn't that everyone suddenly agreed. It was that Elias no longer needed them to. Later that afternoon, sitting again on the familiar park bench, Elias held the compass in his hand. The needle rested calmly, pointing north without hesitation. He smiled, realizing the world hadn't changed much at all, but the place he now looked for direction had quietly moved inward. That evening, Elias returned to the same bench in the park, the place that had quietly become a small classroom for him. The air carried the soft warmth of the setting sun, and the path was nearly empty now. He placed the compass on his palm and watched the needle settle. It didn't feel like a mysterious object anymore, more like a quiet reminder of something simple he had almost forgotten. The old man appeared again, as if the park itself had sent him. He sat beside Elias with the same calm presence, saying nothing at first. For a moment they both watched the sky change colors. Then the man nodded toward the compass. "Looks like it's learned something," he said with a gentle smile. Elias chuckled softly. "I think I'm the one who's learning," he admitted. The man leaned back slightly, clearly pleased by that answer. "Good," he said. "A compass can't teach much if its owner refuses to listen." After a short silence, the man spoke again. "You know," he said, "most people think inner strength requires big changes." He gestured lightly toward Elias's chest. "But often it begins with very small moments. Moments so quiet people almost overlook them. Try this," he continued. "Once a day, just for a minute or two, pause somewhere calm. No phone, no conversation, no distractions. Place your hand over your chest or hold something simple, like that compass. Then take one slow breath." Elias listened carefully. The instructions were almost laughably simple, yet he understood their quiet power now. The man added one more step. "As you breathe out, ask yourself a small question. What do I truly need right now?" the man said gently. "Not what others expect, not what fear is shouting, just what your quiet inner voice already knows. Then listen." The leaves rustled softly around them as the light faded into evening. Elias looked down at the compass again, noticing how peacefully the needle rested. The exercise sounded simple enough for anyone to try. And as he sat there, he sensed that this tiny practice, barely a minute long, might be the doorway to something much deeper. A few weeks passed, and life continued much as it always had. The city remained busy. Conversations still carried their mix of praise and criticism. Unexpected problems still appeared now and then, like sudden rain on a clear afternoon. Yet something inside Elias had shifted quietly. The compass in his pocket was no longer an object of frustration. One morning, as he walked along the familiar park path, a strong wind swept through the trees. Branches swayed, leaves spiraled through the air, and distant clouds gathered on the horizon. The world seemed restless again, as if preparing for a storm. Elias paused for a moment, feeling the breeze tug at his coat. Old habits might have rushed to search for reassurance, but instead he placed a hand over the compass in his pocket. He didn't even take it out this time. He simply stood there, breathing slowly while the wind moved around him. The noise of the world remained, yet something deeper stayed calm, like a lighthouse standing steady while waves roll past. A group of people hurried along the path, speaking anxiously about the coming rain. One of them glanced at Elias standing quietly and laughed lightly. "Looks like you're not worried at all," the stranger said in passing. Elias smiled, though he didn't quite know how to explain it. It wasn't that storms had disappeared from life. It was that he had discovered somewhere steady to stand, not in the approval of others, not in constant reassurance from the outside world, but in a quiet place within himself that had always been there, waiting patiently to be noticed. Later that day, he found himself sitting again on the same park bench. The old man appeared briefly, walking along the path as usual. He didn't stop this time, just gave a small nod as he passed, a gesture that said more than words needed to, as if the lesson had quietly taken root. Elias took the compass from his pocket and held it in the sunlight. The needle pointed north with calm certainty, not perfectly rigid, but steady enough to guide a journey. He smiled, realizing something that once seemed complicated was actually simple. The compass had never needed fixing. It had only needed space away from the noise, and perhaps, Elias thought, People were not so different from that. When we stop searching everywhere else for direction, when we grow quiet long enough to hear ourselves again, a strength appears that no storm can easily shake. The wind softened, the trees settled, and the park returned to its gentle rhythm. Elias slipped the compass back into his pocket and stood up slowly. The path ahead looked the same as always, yet it felt different now, not because the world had become clearer, but because he finally trusted the direction within it.